Good evening. We are returning from recess and going to move on to our two action items, which regard our budget for the district. Do I have a motion to approve the revised budget for fiscal year 2023?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
I'd like to introduce Director of Business Services, Mert Woodard. Welcome.
Good evening, Chair Allenberg, fellow school board directors, and Superintendent Stanley. The fiscal year 2023 revised budget was discussed first at the June 1st work session and also briefly at the June 12th regular meeting. So I'll provide a few high-level highlights about that budget and then open it up for action and discussion. So the fiscal year 2023 budget was crafted in the general fund with a budgeted reduction of about $1.7 million to the overall general fund balance. Pleased to report that we're going to come in better than that. I'm proposing that we revise the budget to reflect a general fund deficit of about $895,000. The reason that we're going to do slightly better than projected is that we serve 66 more pupil units in fiscal year 23 than what the budget was crafted with. So that's going to be an increase of about $700,000 in state aid. We also issued the 2023 general obligation capital notes and facilities maintenance bonds. Of that issuance, about $1.1 million was allocated for technology device purchases and school buses. Those expenditures were originally planned to be made from existing funds. We were able to creatively restructure our debt issuance plans to pay for those out of bond proceeds and push those payments out to 5 and 8 years. So we'll get some fund balance relief in the first year and then pay for those over time, and we'll budget for those expenditures over the life of those items. The construction fund and debt service funds were also revised to reflect the $14.2 million issuance of bonds to finance the construction at Countryside Elementary. And so those are accounted for as well. The revised budget is also part of the fiscal year 2024 executive summary. So those figures can also be found there. The ending fund balance in the unassigned portion of fund balance is estimated to be at 6.88%, a decline from the previous year figure of 7.45%. With that, the recommended action is before you.
Thank you, Director Woodard. Do board members have questions or comments about the revised budget for fiscal year 2023? Great. We will now vote by roll call to approve the revised budget for fiscal year 2023. Allenberg, aye. Aram,
Aye.
Birdman,
Aye.
Gabler,
Aye.
Green,
Aye.
Neville,
Aye.
Shaw.
Aye.
The revised budget for fiscal year 2023 has been approved. Do I have a motion to approve the preliminary budget for fiscal year 2024?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Director Woodard?
Thank you, Chair Allenberg. So this is, I believe, the fourth meeting where we're publicly discussing the preliminary budget for fiscal year 2024. This process began soon after I joined the district in July, really took off in the fall of 2022. So we're here to briefly discuss the executive summary, which is unchanged with the exception of two items, one in the general fund and one in the building construction fund, which are related and have a net effect of 0 on the overall fund balances of the district. So heading into the executive summary on page 1, you'll notice that we listed out our guiding principles, which you're all, of course, very familiar with. We thought it was important to lead our budget documents with those guiding principles as they are a reflection of our values and what we believe the district should be investing in. So it's also always an important reminder to the community that those drive all of our decision-making processes. Pages 2 and 3 depict the governmental fund structure, which we're required to adhere to by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, as well as Minnesota State statute. Edina Public Schools uses 5 main funds to account for its revenues and expenditures, those being the general fund, the food service fund, the community services fund, the building construction fund, and the debt service fund. The general fund is the largest and most significant fund, one that is used to account for the core operations of the school district. So elementary instruction, special education instruction, pupil transportation, administration, building facilities, operations, and pretty much anything under the school district umbrella. There are also those ancillary funds such as food service and the others that I mentioned that are extremely specific in nature. And the general rule of thumb is that those funds can only be used for those specific purposes. So we can't dip into the food service fund beyond certain expenditures to bail out the general fund and vice versa if those funds were operating in a deficit, we would have to bail them out, so to speak, out of the general fund. There's also the object and program descriptions that will aid the user in reading these financial statements. Once a revenue or expenditure is categorized, it's further categorized into those program and object areas. As an example, the object would be the specific item that's being purchased, so a staff member's salary or a staff member's computer, and then the program is the depiction of that staff member's actual role. So it could roll up into the transportation program or the secondary instruction program, depending on what they're actually doing. So those are some fairly basic definitions. There's about 14,000 different combinations that I've mentioned a few times. So that makes for some fun reading on the weekend. Page 4 is the total governmental fund overview. So the entire district, all of its governmental funds. As I mentioned, there's only one change from last week when this was presented, and you'll see that on the general fund and building construction pages. Again, a net effect of 0, and I'll speak more specifically about those when we get to them. The district administration is asking the board tonight to adopt an overall governmental funds revenue and financing sources budget of $191,222,213, and an overall expenditure and financing uses budget of $196,734,048. So the approximate $5.5 million decline is planned for, and that's directly attributable to the $10 million spend down in the building construction fund. Before I begin to examine each of our funds in detail, I'll just remind you that about 80% of our revenues are tied to student enrollment. And so any changes up or down are going to really impact the operations of the district. As of today, I believe we are registered with about 8,530 students for next school year, for K through 12. If you add in our earliest learners, our pre-K students, we'd expect to serve about 8,594 students on an average daily membership basis. You'll notice that the figure I have listed is 8,563, and there are two reasons for the deviation. One, the school board approved the preliminary property tax levy for next fiscal year in December at that 8,563 figure. Also, you'll know that historically from June and July to the first day of school, we'll notice a slight decline in student enrollment as families move out of the district or choose other options for their students. So we think the 8,563 figure is going to be within 1% of the actual number at the end of fiscal year 24. So we're quite confident in that figure. Also, for those who aren't intimately involved with the district, we're going to be adding about 48 students to Countryside Elementary next school year, and we'll add about 200 students over the course of the next 4 fiscal years as we build our cohort to a full K-5 dual language immersion program. On page 6, you'll see the specific figures for the general fund. As previously mentioned, this is our main operating fund and the one that finances the core of our mission and our vision. Earlier this school year, we performed a forecast of all of our existing programs and staff. Were we to maintain those staff in the next school year, and that exercise resulted in an indicated $4 million deficit above the current year. Once that information was shared with the school board and stakeholders, the BERG process was immediately enacted, and we developed a process to contain district expenditures by that exact figure of $4,085,000. That process concluded with the school board approving 20 different cost-saving measures, resulting in the elimination of that entire deficit, with 20%, just 20% of that elimination of expenditures relating to staff that directly interact with students. So we had a right sizing of our middle school programs and the elimination of paraprofessionals added with one-time federal pandemic funding that made up the 20% reduction in staff. So that process was concluded in February, and at that point, we were actually prepared to probably adopt a preliminary budget. Of course, there was the 2023 legislative session, and that's why we did not do that at that time. We were waiting to see the results of that, and we budgeted very conservatively, and thankfully, the legislature did appropriate significantly more funds than anticipated. Most notably, the special education cross-subsidy aid increase. Over the last several years, that number has been at 6.43% of the calculated cross-subsidy. Next school year, that's going to be 44%. And so that 44% will actually be based on expenditures in the current fiscal year, because special education reimbursements are always on the prior year numbers. And so we'll see about a $3 to $3.5 million increase in that funding source. The basic education formula, which finances the large portion of the district's finances, is going from 2% to 4%. We had budgeted at 2%. The additional 2% is going to yield an additional $1.3 million based on our student enrollment. So that's above and beyond what we had already budgeted. English language learner revenue has also increased tremendously from $724 per pupil unit to $1,228 for an additional $240,000 in revenue. So very thankful for all the efforts of the LAC for engaging our senators and representatives and all the stakeholders kind of banding together to get those historic funds to school districts. Therefore, our final recommendation at this time for revenues is $154,449,311. That includes the additional $4.8 million above and beyond our estimates that were appropriated from the state. We'll also recommend an expenditure budget of $149,411,639. That's going to result in an increase to overall general fund balance of just over $5 million, leaving our unassigned fund balance at the end of fiscal year 2024 at 8.7%, which is above the board minimum of 6%, but below the high end of 10%. The school board also maintains a 2% set-aside policy for the committed fund balance, which will be adhered to within this proposed budget. We anticipate our overall general fund balance at the end of fiscal year 2024 to be 16.2%, which is a significant increase over the estimated 12.5% or so at the end of fiscal year 2023. And for more specifics on where those fund balances will be added within the general fund, those are detailed on page 11 of the executive summary. I did note that there was one change from the materials that were presented last week, and you will specifically see that in the other financing uses section on page 6. There is a $6.3 million figure in the bottom right corner. Last week, that figure read $2 million. As you know, we finance our long-term facilities maintenance program on both a pay-as-you-go basis and on a bonding basis. For projects that are more than $2 million at a site, for example, the high school project that is breaking ground this summer, costs that are in excess of that $2 million need to be transferred from the general fund, which collects the tax revenues, and moved over to the building construction fund, which will account for the expenditures. So that's why that's different than the $2 million that was there. It's really a moving target. As you know, construction projects are completed over many years, so that's fairly fluid. Again, no fund balancing impact. Page 7 explains the proposed food service fund for next school year. We're proposing a break even, so $3.7 million in expenditures, $3.7 million in revenues. We'll be serving universal free meals for all students next school year, so that's 1 free breakfast and 1 free lunch. We believe that's going to lead to some increased participation. However, at this point, we budgeted based on historical trends, and we'll adjust accordingly as we see more participation. So nothing major going on in that fund, with the exception of that new law. A very healthy fund balances of more than 30%, which is not common in school districts, so very pleased with the performance there. Fund 4 is our other special revenue fund, one that depends solely on user fees to sustain itself. We're anticipating the continuance of the great demand we have for our community ed programs, particularly Kids Club. And so we're anticipating a small increase to fund balance in that fund of about $188,000. So total revenue of $12,081,362, total expenditures of $11,892,848. Again, that fund has a very healthy fund balance. The building construction fund, that's the one that is used to account for our large-scale construction projects, ones that are not deemed maintenance. And so we have the countryside addition in that fund. We also have the high school project in that fund, and also the spend down and completion of the bus garage. There's some small items still there to be completed. And so we're proposing a revenue budget of $642,886. Actually, that figure appears to be a typo. That should be closer to 6.9 million. I'll have to fix that, actually. So that transfer in of $6.3 million is not actually a revenue, it's another financing source. So an acquisition of fund balance that needs to be added to the executive budget that's posted to our website. I'll make sure to make that adjustment. And our total expenditures of about 17 million. So the deficit of 10 million is planned for. We received the funds to construct those facilities in prior periods, and we'll be spending them down in subsequent periods until, in theory, they reach zero. Finally, the debt service fund. The previous fund was the construction of facilities. The debt service fund is related to the financing. So each fiscal year, we collect property taxes to pay down the debt that we've issued to construct those facilities. This fund is only used for those purposes. At this time, it's a great to mention that we maintain our AAA bond rating twice this school year. I'm very pleased with that. That allows us to issue debt at the lowest possible cost for our taxpayers. And we're one of 3 districts in the state of Minnesota to hold that coveted rating, and one of about 70 to 90, depending on the year, across the country. So that fund, we're anticipating revenue of $14.3 million approximately, with expenditures of about $14.6 million. So that spend down is planned as we extinguish our debt to completion in 2039, assuming we don't issue any more debt between that time period. That brings us to page 11, which is the full fund balance report, a very detailed specimen that lists every fund balance the district owns, and a number of appendices were also added to the financial statements for your review and consideration. With that, over to you, Chair Allenberg, for action and discussion.
Thank you very much. I'll turn it over to board members for their comments or questions. And I guess first question I have, I was going to ask the Finance Committee if they have any comments that they'd like to make about the budget process or the budget in general.
Sure, thank you. I think one of the things we've highlighted in all of the conversations that we've had about this is the appreciation for the proactive approach to rebuilding our fund balance and the importance that that has in the health of the district, the fiscal health of our district. And just to remind any community members that not only is it important because it allows us to take advantage of a lower cost of borrowing money, right? We reap many benefits from that. And alternatively, if we did not have that, the risk we'd be putting ourselves at, not only just having increased cost of things, but just the risk we would be putting ourselves at is pretty significant. So I appreciate the intentional work behind that, and also wanted to call the attention that you did mention, and people can see in the board packet where we stand versus other neighboring districts and what our goals look like. So I just wanted to share that one piece.
Go ahead, Michael.
I think that even though you didn't mention it, Mert, I think that the Appendix B is also incredibly valuable information for people to pay attention to. This is the breakdown of actually where our program description and dollars are actually spent. When you look at over almost 80.5% of all funds that are expended within the district are all for actual pupil services. So we do try to run an administratively tight ship where possible. You still have to have administration, you still have to have direct district support. But I think that this is information, if you actually look at the 3-year trend from the actually audited results to the budgeted results that are concluding here in 23, and then what the budgeted results are for 24, you can continue to see where we are having increases in those costs, but we're trying to manage, especially the administrative costs, while we're still keeping dollars in the classroom. So I think that that's another important element to look at as our funding and our expenditures continue to fluctuate over that period of time. So all the really amazing fiscal management that we're doing enables us to stay focused on that. So unfortunately, when we then have a BERG process, how are we able to manage that? We're able to go from that standpoint. So that's just another part that I wanted to call out in the packet. Thank you.
Director Aram, anything from Finance Committee perspective?
No, I was going to highlight the same.
Okay.
thing I was talking about.
Thank you. Anything, Director Green?
Thank you, Director Woodard, for this presentation. I just wanted to share my thanks for another fantastic AAA rating that we got this year, and twice. That is no small feat, and so I'm just really proud of our operational excellence in this area. So I wanted to call that out. I have a quick question about our food service funding. Can you just explain a little bit about, with the passing of universal lunches, what is that impact? Are we, like, how does that work? I guess in my mind, I have a hard time understanding how that funding supports. Is it meals? Is it based on how many come through the line, or how that all works? If you could just give a little bit on what we know. Thank you.
Absolutely, Director Green. Excellent question. So the way it works is when a student actually goes through the point of sale system and receives a meal that is considered reimbursable, so it has all the components that are required by the USDA to qualify as a reimbursable meal. At that point, that student is tallied. We submit those reimbursements to the state of Minnesota. They review them, and then the federal government will subsidize a portion of those meals or all of it, depending on the qualification of the student. So this legislation really impacts the students that do not receive free and reduced lunch. Currently, the state is paying about 12 cents for those meals, and the federal pays a very small portion. So what the state is now going to do is they're going to pay us the difference between what the federal government is paying for paid students and what the federal government is paying for free and reduced students.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful. Can I ask one other follow-up question?
Absolutely.
So let's say a student comes through and doesn't purchase the full USDA approved. What is that? What happens then?
So the way it works is Chartwells, who provides all of our meals and they set the menus, they craft the menu so that every item is inherently there. And that the tray that the student receives or when they go through the line, they are encouraged to take all the components, and most comply with that. Were they to go through with an incomplete meal, we would not be able to fully receive reimbursement for those meals. For example, if a high school student came through with just an a la carte item, just one of those Celsius energy drinks, for example, that would not meet the qualification. Therefore, it's not a reimbursable meal, and in fact, we have to charge a special price for those items.
Sorry about that. Are any students allowed seconds with the free and reduced, or not free and reduced, but with the universal lunch?
Yeah, so students are allowed to take second lunches. However, they're not financed in any way by the state or the federal government. So they would need to be charged at the adult rate, which is going to be a minimum of $4.95. We're anticipating that will increase on July 1st. So no second lunches, no a la carte items. None of those are covered by the National School Lunch Program.
Okay, thank you.
And so just to be clear for those parents out there who have students, that while yes, they certainly can go into the line and get the provided for meal, if they end up going through getting something else and so on and so forth, they would still need to have money in their account in order to purchase those items or pay cash or whatever the other processes that Chartwells provides.
Absolutely. So that's going to be a key communication piece for the district as students transition back to school after 3 months off in the summer.
Director Gabler?
I want to echo what everyone has said about the work that's gone into this, and school finance is not a simple process. So I always appreciate, Director Woodard, how you educate as well as in your presentations. And I really appreciate the additional appendix that you added for this presentation. I had a question, if you could clarify for me on Appendix C, or in Appendix C, there's line items of other expenditures and other financing uses. Can you give me some examples of what would fall into either of those categories?
So the major piece of the other expenditures category are subscriptions and membership dues and fees, and also items that can't really be categorized in any other place. For example, we had a recent legal matter that we had to pay a settlement for, and so that belongs in that other expenditures category. It's one that's rarely used, and if you see large variances there, they really stick out. The other financing uses, so that's a depletion of fund balance that is not considered an expenditure. For example, we are sending $6.337 million from the general fund to the building construction fund. That's not really an expense. However, it is a reduction of fund balance, all else being equal. And so since it's not categorized as an expenditure, it needs to be classified in another way, but it is a reduction to the fund balance.
Thank you.
Director Nepple, did you have any questions or comments?
Thank you. I just have one question for Director Woodard. I echo everyone else's comments in praising the presentation. The budget information is very clear. I appreciate the detail and the summary. My question is to help our board and the community better understand the impact of the most recent legislative session. It's been a very fortunate session for finances for school districts. Could you please summarize and help us understand what we can expect. Here are some good things that we're able to do in our next year budget, and some things that we may have hoped for, but realistically are not able to be put into this budget.
Thank you for the question, Director Neville. In terms of the positives, stability is always important. More predictable funding is always important, so we're able to craft our long-term budgeting and what we deem as a district to be worthwhile in investing. It's going to be easier to do that, all else being equal. I think the main win for us as a school district is maintaining some of our excellent programming. You'll have noticed in House File 2497, there's an appropriation for media specialists. There's an appropriation for additional counselors or psychologists. Those are areas where this district is historically very well staffed, above and beyond many districts that are compared to the district. So we'll be able to maintain those programs more comfortably than those in the past. So that's the main win. In terms of enhancing the district's programs, again, we have many of those features already in place. However, this will allow the administration and board to better plan for enhancements and be able to meet our fund balance policy. Again, our fund balance generally is going to be about 16% at the end of next school year, assuming we don't deploy any of these additional funds. That's a vast improvement over where we have been historically the last 3 to 5 years, but still one that keeps us behind some of our neighboring districts. And so that's important to keep in mind as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? The only comment I wanted to make, and I think Director Neville, your question was a segue to the comment I wanted to make was, although the investment from the state is very much appreciated, I think that right now we are still parsing through the information to know also what is required of us from an investment perspective, with a lot of the requirements that went into this session as well. And so I think that if I could describe this budget, I would describe it as putting a lot of money in a savings account until we have a better idea of what our requirements are from the state and what they are going to ask us to do with this money, because we are still learning exactly what is going to be required of us. And once we know that, if we can make enhancements to our district, we will be discussing that at a later date in the fall. So I just want the community to understand that we're very grateful for the additional money. We are still working through exactly what that means, and we still have a necessity to add money to our fund balance for years past that we've taken money out of it to keep operating our district. But if we are able to do enhancements, that will come at a later date. Is that an accurate way to describe sort of how we're trying to approach it from a process perspective?
Yes, Chair Ellenberg, that's absolutely an accurate depiction of what's happened. And to be more specific about some of those impacts, first I would encourage anyone viewing this session to view the LAC recap recording that occurred, I believe, last week. So there's 3 main components that school districts are concerned with at this time. That would be the school term employees, so those who are off from June to the end of August, those individuals being eligible for unemployment benefits for up to 12 weeks. So that's number one. The school district has between 250 to 300 employees that would be eligible for this funding. And were all of those individuals to claim their benefit that they have a right to now, that would cost the district about $1.2 million. Of course, not all of those individuals are going to claim benefits. However, we budget conservatively and figure that they will. The state has appropriated a one-time pot of money of $135 million to last for the next 4 years, actually. A recent AMSD survey, the Association of Metropolitan School Districts, indicated that the average school district will see a $229 per average daily membership cost associated, and so that $135 million, in my opinion, would be depleted before that 4 years. So that would be something the district would have to maintain in perpetuity. Something else the district will have to pay for in perpetuity beginning in fiscal year '26 would be paid medical leave for all employees up to 20 weeks. The way that's going to be funded is a 0.7% premium allocated to all taxable wages. And so that's going to be about a recurring $800,000 expenditure from fiscal year '26 onward. Again, no additional funds appropriated for that at this time. It might change in the next biennium. However, we're also budgeting conservatively for that. The third and perhaps most important component is the addition of the loss of certain inherent managerial rights as part of terms and conditions of employment. The cost of that totally unknown at this point, and we'll figure that out over the next 2 to 4 years. So.
Thank you, and thank you for all your work and your work, Dr. Stanley, on this. Appreciate it. Anything else? Great. We'll now vote by roll call to approve the preliminary budget for fiscal year 2024. Allenberg? Oh, that's me. Aye. Aram?
Aye.
Bergman?
Aye.
Gabler?
Aye.
Green?
Aye.
Neville?
Aye.
Oh,
Aye.
Shaw?
Aye.
The preliminary budget for fiscal year 2024 is approved. Yay, good job. You made it. Thank you very much. That takes care of our action items. So we're going to take another recess and move into closed session. So thank you, everyone.